Storytelling in photography has a fairly big limitation. A story occurs through time, but a photo is just this small slice of time. Can a photo actually tell a story? And if not, then what is narrative photography? It's a question I've been asking myself for almost a decade. Ever since I realized that the portraits I was making with a group of Mexica should be about more than just aesthetics, my interest went beyond the skin deep. And I wanted my photos to do the same, to not just document the Mexica, but to communicate the fascinating stories and characters that fill their mythology. So I've had a lot of time to think about this question. And I think the answer is no. Not in the way we typically think of stories anyway, as a series of events arranged into, a particular sequence. One image just can't communicate that level of complexity. But if a photo can't tell a story, then what is narrative photography? Well, just because a photo can't tell a traditional story doesn't mean it can't be narrative. This actually makes me think of another big limitation of photography, because it's not just time that's absent from a photo, it's also depth. Photos are 2D representations of our 3D world. And of course, that limitation hasn't stopped us fine-tuning how we communicate that lost dimension. Depth of field, tonal contrast, color contrast, atmospheric effects. And if we can trick our mind into seeing depth, maybe we can trick it into seeing story. Many of my favorite photographers create images that could be described as cinematic. This shared style probably isn't a coincidence. Watch a movie and you're watching a story unfold. The two are intertwined in our minds. So when you emulate that cinematic style, you're kind of priming a viewer for story. The feedback I get the most seems to kind of back this up. When a viewer is in that frame of mind, the model in your photo becomes elevated to a character in a story. And I think that's how you get a narrative photo. Adopting a cinematic style is an effective way to prime your viewer for narrative. But what if you want to say something specific? If your limitation is a lack of time, then adding more time seems like a pretty logical place to start. A long exposure shows the passing of time, and that can help convey visceral concepts that can be hard to visualize in a frozen moment. Concepts like calmness or serenity, or the complete opposite, loneliness and anxiety, for example. Long exposures can be used to communicate even more specific story ideas. This image here was inspired by Mexica mythology, a story where the god Xiuhtecutli uses fire to help usher in a new sunrise. And I wanted to visually communicate that exact moment of the story, so I used a long exposure to create the shape of a sun cresting the horizon. Okay, quick recap. A photo's ability to tell a story is limited. We can prime a viewer for story, we can include some narrative clues in our photo, but ultimately, I think that's about the limit for photography. Luckily, that's where something pretty awesome can happen. The viewer can take over the narrative. I remember the first photo where I noticed this. It was this image by Gregory Crutzen, who's an American photographer. I never saw this as a model posing for a photo. To me, this was always a scene from a story, and my mind filled in the gaps in that story. Because that's what humans do. We're story-seeking animals. We can't help but create narratives that help us make sense of the world around us. I think this is where the bulk of storytelling happens in photography. Once you draw someone into that narrative frame of mind, They'll weave their own story, like I did with this guy, you know, standing so desolately out there in the pouring rain. The story I created is why I love this image. Everyone has a different take on what makes a great photograph. I think it goes beyond skin deep, beyond aesthetics. A great photo has a story to tell, and it's going to make you the narrator.